Researchers here in France have uncovered a child's tooth and stone tools dating back some 54,000 years.
Researchers in France made a discovery that seemed almost insignificant at first. A child's tooth and a collection of stone tools dating back roughly 54,000 years. To most people, it sounded like another archaeological headline. But hidden inside that tiny tooth was a story so extraordinary that it would challenge everything scientists believed about the first people to survive in the Arctic. Thousands of miles away, deep within the frozen wilderness of Siberia, another child's baby tooth lay locked inside solid permafrost for more than 31,000 years. It belonged to a child who had lived and died at the very top of the world, in temperatures so brutal they should have been impossible for humans to endure. For over 3 millennia, the child had no name, no face, and no story. Only silence. Then scientists carefully extracted DNA from the tiny tooth. As the ancient genetic code slowly appeared on their computer screens, the room grew quiet. The results didn't simply identify an unknown child. They revealed someone no one had expected to exist. At almost the same time, Russian scientists announced another breathtaking discovery: an exceptionally well-preserved baby mammoth emerging from the Siberian permafrost, frozen as though time itself had stopped. Yet remarkable as that discovery was, the greatest secret buried beneath the Arctic wasn't the mammoth. It was the child. Because hidden inside that ancient DNA was evidence powerful enough to rewrite the history of an entire hemisphere. To understand how that happened, you have to travel back to the summer of 2001, to a lonely stretch of the Yana River in northeastern Siberia, a place where nobody expected to uncover one of archaeology's greatest surprises. An expedition from the Russian Academy of Sciences, led by archaeologist Vladimir Petulko, was surveying the banks of the Yana River in what is now the Sakha Republic. The location was extraordinary. Nearly 71 degrees north latitude, almost 480 kilometers, around 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle. This wasn't simply cold. This was the high Arctic, a land of continuous permafrost, endless winters, and some of the harshest conditions on Earth. At the time, scientists believed humans could never have survived here during the Ice Age. According to every accepted theory, people hadn't ventured this far north until thousands of years later, after the climate had warmed and conditions became more forgiving. The Yana expedition was partly intended to test that assumption, but no one standing along that frozen riverbank seriously expected it to collapse. Then someone noticed something protruding from the eroding cliff. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary piece of horn trapped inside the frozen sediment. But as researchers carefully removed it, they realized they were holding something unmistakably human. It was the carved horn of a woolly rhinoceros. More specifically, it was a foreshaft, the front section of a sophisticated hunting weapon designed to fit onto a spear or dart. Every cut and every shape had been deliberately crafted by skilled hands. This wasn't nature. It was technology. The artifact became so important that the entire location was named after it: the Yana Rhinoceros Horn Site. What followed astonished everyone. Excavations uncovered more than 2,500 additional artifacts. There were finely crafted stone tools, ivory projectile points, mammoth bone foreshafts, more worked rhinoceros horn, and even fragments of beautifully decorated ivory ornaments that had once formed part of a hairband or headband worn by someone who had lived there thousands of years earlier. The discoveries alone were extraordinary, but the radiocarbon dates changed everything. The site wasn't 10,000 years old. It wasn't even 20,000 years old. It dated back approximately 31,600 years. Suddenly, The Yana site became the earliest and northernmost confirmed human settlement from the Pleistocene ever discovered anywhere on Earth. Human beings had been living nearly 480 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle more than 30,000 years ago, hunting mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses in conditions once thought completely impossible. The old timeline wasn't slightly inaccurate. It was wrong by tens of thousands of years. Yet despite uncovering thousands of artifacts, the site refused to reveal the people themselves. No skulls, no skeletons, no human bones, nothing. It was one of archaeology's strangest mysteries. Researchers held weapons once carried by hunters, examined ornaments once worn by families, and studied tools shaped by skilled craftsmen. Every object testified to human lives lived in the Arctic. Yet the people themselves had vanished without a trace. Scientists joked that perhaps the only hope left was finding traces of ancient DNA left behind in the soil itself. For nearly 20 years, the mystery remained unsolved. The camp was full of human activity, but completely empty of human remains. Then, finally, the frozen ground surrendered two tiny treasures. They weren't dramatic. They weren't beautiful. They were simply two deciduous molars, baby teeth that had fallen from the mouths of two young boys around 31,600 years ago, before becoming locked forever inside the Siberian permafrost. Remarkably, they remain the only confirmed human remains ever recovered from the site. Just two tiny milk teeth. Nothing more. Scientists immediately understood how precious they were. Unlike stone tools or carved ivory, these teeth still carried something infinitely more valuable: DNA. They were sent to specialized laboratories where researchers carefully extracted the surviving genetic material, hoping to discover who these children had been. What came back exceeded every expectation. The results didn't merely identify the inhabitants of Yana. They revealed an entirely unknown human population, a population whose existence forced scientists to rethink the peopling of northern Asia and, ultimately, the Americas. But to appreciate why those two teeth mattered so much, you first have to imagine the world those boys were born into. The Yana River flows north from the Verkhoyansk Mountains toward the Laptov Sea, through what is now the Sakha Republic of Russia. During the Ice Age, the settlement stood near the southern edge of an enormous Arctic landmass that included what would later become the famous Bering Land Bridge, the vast stretch of exposed land connecting Siberia and Alaska whenever sea levels fell. Surrounding everything was an ecosystem unlike anything alive today. The Mammoth Steppe, an immense frozen grassland stretching from Western Europe across northern Asia and into Alaska. Its scale is almost impossible to comprehend. It was likely the largest and most productive grassland Earth has ever known. Across its endless plains wandered enormous herds of woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, horses, reindeer, and saiga antelope. Following them came predators equally impressive: wolves, cave lions, cave hyenas, and humans. This frozen grassland eventually became the great highway leading into the Americas. Yet the people of Yana weren't living comfortably along its southern edge. They were deep inside the high Arctic itself. At 71 degrees north latitude, more than 15,000 years before the last ice age even reached its coldest phase. Few places on Earth have ever been more hostile to human life. And yet, the evidence shows these people weren't merely surviving. They were thriving. Imagine enduring a single Arctic winter, months of darkness, temperatures capable of killing an exposed person within minutes. No crops, no forests. Every calorie earned by hunting enormous animals powerful enough to kill the hunter instead. To survive under those conditions required far more than courage. It demanded expertly tailored clothing, reliable shelters, constant fire, sophisticated hunting weapons, long-term planning, and communities willing to share knowledge across generations. These were not desperate refugees wandering north by accident. They had chosen this life, and they possessed the skills necessary to master it. The archaeological evidence proves it. The stone used to make many of their tools wasn't found nearby. It had been transported from distant quarries, revealing organized supply networks stretching across the Arctic landscape. The ivory projectile points were carefully engineered hunting weapons. The mammoth bone foreshafts formed part of complex composite tools assembled from multiple materials. Even more revealing was the decorated ivory headband. It served no practical purpose for survival. It represented identity, adornment, symbolism, culture. It was unmistakable evidence that these Ice Age Arctic hunters were not simply surviving. They were fully human in every meaningful sense. And perhaps the most astonishing part of this entire story is how fragile the evidence truly is. Everything we know about these remarkable people, their ancestry, their survival, their place in human history, everything rests upon just two tiny baby teeth that two young boys lost on the frozen ground more than 31,000 years ago. Those genetic adaptations weren't random mutations that appeared overnight. They were the product of thousands of years spent surviving one of the harshest environments on Earth. Every brutal winter, every successful hunt, every child who survived long enough to have children of their own slowly shaped the DNA of these ancient people. The 2019 study suggested that some of those Arctic survival genes may have entered the human family tree through this very population, the ancient North Siberians. Long before the Yana boys were born, their ancestors had already been adapting to endless darkness, sub-zero temperatures, and a landscape where a single mistake could mean death. Generation after generation, natural selection quietly rewrote their biology, preparing them for a world few humans could survive. And perhaps the most remarkable part is that those same genetic signatures are still present today. They're carried by indigenous peoples living across Siberia and throughout the Americas, silent reminders of a forgotten population whose name disappeared tens of thousands of years ago, but whose DNA never truly vanished. The discoveries reached even further. For decades, archaeologists had debated one of the greatest mysteries in human history, a theory known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. The idea was simple. The ancestors of Native Americans didn't immediately cross into the Americas after reaching northeastern Siberia. Instead, they became isolated for thousands of years somewhere in Beringia, the enormous land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska during the Ice Age. There, cut off from the rest of Eurasia by massive glaciers and from the Americas by impassable ice sheets, they evolved into a distinct population before finally expanding south as the glaciers retreated. It was an elegant theory, but until recently it lacked convincing genetic proof. The Yana genomes changed that. By combining DNA from the Yana boys with later individuals like the Malta child, Kolyma 1, and the ancient Beringian infant USR1, researchers could finally trace the sequence almost step by step. The timing fit together with remarkable precision. The ancient North Siberians established themselves deep in Arctic Siberia more than 31,000 years ago. Later, they mixed with East Asian populations somewhere across northeastern Siberia or Beringia. That mixed population remained isolated for thousands of years. Then, around 16,000 years ago, as the great ice sheets began to retreat, their descendants spread into North and South America, eventually populating two entire continents. For one of archaeology's longest-running mysteries, the Yana discovery provided something incredibly rare. a timeline that actually worked. But the implications stretched beyond migration. They changed how scientists viewed the Arctic itself. For generations, textbooks portrayed Ice Age humans as cautiously following warmer climates, slowly expanding northward only when conditions became favorable. Jana shattered that image. These people hadn't waited for the Arctic to become easier. They had mastered it while it was still at its most unforgiving. 31,000 years ago, they weren't standing on the edge of civilization. They were living at its frontier. Their camps overlooked endless frozen grasslands where mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and massive bison roamed beneath skies that remained dark for months each winter. They built sophisticated hunting weapons. They transported stone across enormous distances. They crafted ornaments not because they needed them to survive, but because beauty and identity mattered. They raised children. They buried none of that history in books. Instead, they left it hidden beneath frozen soil. It's easy to think of prehistory as empty, a vast stretch of time occupied by nameless people living simple lives. Jana tells a completely different story. These weren't primitive wanderers stumbling through an unforgiving landscape. They were explorers, engineers, hunters, parents, storytellers, members of communities that had solved problems humanity had never faced before. Everything they accomplished happened without metal, without farming, without cities, and without written language. Yet they created a society capable of surviving where modern humans would struggle even with today's technology. And somehow, after thriving for thousands of years, they disappeared. Not all at once, not through some dramatic catastrophe. Instead, new populations gradually moved into northeastern Siberia. They mixed with some groups, replaced others, and over thousands of years, the distinct identity of the ancient North Siberians slowly faded from the landscape. Their language vanished, their traditions disappeared, even their name was forgotten, until genetics found them again. There's something almost poetic about that. For centuries, historians searched for great civilizations by uncovering temples, palaces, and monuments. The ancient North Siberians left none of those behind. No towering pyramids, no stone cities, no written records, only a handful of expertly crafted tools, a decorated ivory headband, and two tiny baby teeth lying quietly beneath the Arctic permafrost. Those teeth survived every empire that would ever rise. They survived every war, every civilization, every language, every religion. They waited patiently beneath frozen ground until science became advanced enough to hear what they had been saying all along. Sometimes history isn't rewritten by discovering a lost city. Sometimes it begins with something so small that it fits in the palm of your hand. A child's tooth, 31,000 years old, and inside it, the forgotten beginning of an entire branch of humanity. The 2019 paper suggested some of those Arctic survival alleles may have entered the human gene pool, partly through this very ancient North Siberian line. Their bodies had been learning the cold for thousands of years before the boys were even born. It even pinned down a long-running puzzle called the Beringian standstill hypothesis. The idea that the founders of the Americas sat isolated in the land bridge region for thousands of years before spilling south. The Jana data nailed the timing. The ancient North Siberian and East Asian blend that made the first Americans happened back in Siberia, not in Beringia, not after they arrived. It was already finished before they ever reached the bridge. So, the genomes told us exactly who these people were related to. What they couldn't tell us was what it actually felt like to be one of them. And they leave behind a darker question that the bones can't touch: how they lived. For the texture of it, you go back to the objects. The rhinoceros horn foreshaft, the imported stone, the ivory points, the headband. The animal bones make the menu concrete. They hunted woolly mammoth and woolly rhinoceros and took steppe bison, reindeer, hares, and ducks on top. The full spread of the mammoth steppe. They butchered on site, turned bone into tools, ivory into weapons and ornaments, and they wore decorated things on their bodies. That headband fragment gets me every time. It's small, it's broken, but it's the same human impulse you'd recognize anywhere, to make something beautiful and wear it. These people didn't just grit their teeth and endure the Arctic. They lived there with culture, with identity, with art. And two little boys grew up inside that world, taught who they were and what their things were supposed to mean. And that's the thing the genetics can't reach, isn't it? The genome can tell you a boy's ancestry to within a few percent. It can't tell you whether he was allowed to wear that headband yet, or what it meant when he finally was. It can't tell you the name his mother called him across the camp, or the story the old ones told about where the mammoths came from. All of that lived in voices, and the voices are gone, which is exactly what makes the rest of it so hard to explain. Because the people who mastered the top of the world, who seeded a third of 2 entire continents, did not last. And, to this day, nobody can fully say where they came from before Yana, or why, in the end, they simply disappeared. The vanishing. Here's what we do know. By around 20,000 years ago, at the deepest, coldest point of the last ice age, the ancient North Siberians had been largely replaced across northeastern Siberia by that Paleo-Siberian wave pushing in from the south and east. The line didn't vanish completely. Its biggest legacy is everything it gave to Native Americans. But, as a living people holding the Yana country, they were simply gone. And this turns out to be one of the great unsettling lessons of ancient DNA. Over and over, the people living somewhere thousands of years ago turn out not to be the ancestors of the people living there now. The ancient North Siberians are one case. The hunter-gatherers of pre-Neolithic Europe, overrun first by farmers out of Anatolia, then by Bronze Age migrants off the Eurasian steppe, are another. Movement and replacement, not quiet continuity, is the real story of our species. So, sit with the strange shape of it. A founding people who handed 2 continents a third of their blood, erased in the exact ground they had conquered. Their true descendants aren't in Siberia at all. They're in every indigenous community across the Americas. The mammoth steppe warmed and collapsed. The great herds died off or shrank away, and the world these boys knew stopped existing. But the deepest question is still wide open. We can trace the split from Western Eurasians to about 38,000 years ago, but the roughly 7,000 years between that split and Yana is a blank. The Yana boys are the oldest point we found, not the beginning. The beginning lies somewhere further west, and older still, in people no one has dug up yet, which means the first chapter of this whole story is still down there. Frozen, unread, the teeth. The work hasn't stopped. Pitulko and his team keep excavating. Later studies have gone deep on the stone tools, the animal bones, and the chemistry that reveals what these people actually ate across the seasons. The site keeps talking, and still those 2 milk teeth are the only human remains it has ever given up. The way forward is more sites, more frozen remains, more genomes. But come back one last time to the 2 children. At some point in their short lives, each of them lost a baby tooth into the floor of the Yana camp, and those teeth lay in the permafrost for 31,600 years. Through the rest of the Ice Age, through the melt, through farming and cities and writing, and all of recorded history, until Mokhanov's people found the site in 2001